you want. All right, everyone, welcome back. It is the next Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar. I got the okay that the stream is good. Welcome, YouTube. Welcome, everyone on Zoom. Okay, excellent. So we are pleased today to have with us Dr. Holden Harris. And let's go ahead and hide that, get you here. So Holden Harris is a quantitative ecologist. He studies coastal, marine and coastal social ecological systems. He has his PhD in interdisciplinary ecology and fisheries and aquatic sciences, and over 15 years of experience in coastal and marine research. I don't know if you added it up, but it's getting to be quite a bit. So what Holden does is he uses sort of synthetic methods, synthesis science, and ecosystem modeling to understand how environmental change and human activities affect the services, ecosystem services, and coastal systems. He's been supported by a lot of nice grants in the past, including an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, the Guy Harvey Ocean Scholarship or Fellowship, and also fellowships from the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute and the Milnet Ocean Foundation. He's published widely on invasive species dynamics, ecosystem modeling, fisheries innovation, and he's been recognized for advancing both the science and the solutions toward fisheries management. Holden's had a variety of career positions in the last year. I won't go into too much detail, but just to mention that he's been a really strong advocate for sciences. That means in the discipline, that means on social media, that means in policy forums, it means on Capitol Hill, it means pressing the case for science really hard at a time when it can be very difficult to do so. So thank you and hats off for doing that. And Dr. Harris, the floor is yours. And I think if you click, you should be good to go.
Well, thank you. Introduction, David. I'm Holden Harris. The title today is A Voyage Down the Land-to-Ocean Aquatic Continuum, Modeling the Impacts of Land Use and Climate Change for Coastal Food Webs and Fisheries. And so we're going to be talking a lot about modeling, which I think is pretty exciting. What can make it even more exciting is thinking about this as a journey. And we're going to be talking about a lot about this concept of kind of a holistic idea of thinking about the watershed connected all the way to the estuary or the land-ocean aquatic continuum. Journey today is going to start at the headwaters, where we're going to think about this idea, the confluence where it comes together. We'll talk about qualitative modeling and case studies of Gulf of Mexico estuaries and their watersheds. And then we'll get into the main channel and we'll talk some about research that was conducted as part of a broad interdisciplinary team of simulating land use and climate change, specifically looking at the Suwannee River watershed and estuary. We have some of the scientists that worked on that here today too. Crossing the bar, moving out into the ocean, I think what we're really going to kind of dig into is linking the hydrology model to the ecosystem model, and where we're going to kind of open up the hood and look underneath a little more is this ecosystem model, which is the part that myself and Dave Harris worked on. And then we'll return to port and kind of think about this a little bit more holistically. So here's the crew of our voyage here. This was done as part of my postdoc funding this interdisciplinary project. It was led by Mike Allen up here, was supported by the National Academies of Science and Medicine. And then we had the different components of this project. So I'm going to be presenting some of my own research, some of others' research here. So we had the hydrology team here in the upper left. I think Nick came as part of that later. Our ecology team down here, the economics team, and then our stakeholder engagement. And this was all done within one university at UF, which I think is pretty impressive. And then also present some work that was related to this. It was led by Scott Alpern, who was a PhD student, and his advisor at the time, Charlie Martin, Brad Enos at the Nature Coast Biological Station, some of the qualitative work. All right, so the headwaters, our introduction. Thinking about this idea of a connected land-ocean aquatic continuum. It's philosophical in nature, but it's also deeply practical and important. I think about this, and my background is a marine and coastal ecologist. So that's usually a lot of times my thinking where I come at this. But in reality, the system is totally connected. What drives the marine and coastal environment ultimately is linked to the terrestrial environment through water, through the watershed. And so the key resources of fresh water and nutrients that comes from upstream, as well as things that we don't like nutrients, overnutrients, plastics, toxins. So it brings things we like and things that we don't like. And thinking about a holistic system raises a lot of challenges for doing science and studying the system. There's one system in science for managing it. And the greatest scale we can think of here in North America is the Mississippi River. And so the sheer scale of it is immense. 90% of the nutrients that are delivered to the Gulf come from the Mississippi River, delivers about 80% of its fresh water, and that's because it drains this enormous part, about 40% of the continental United States. And then amongst that is very complex. It's this complex system. And so this is an illustration made for this paper. And the idea here is, we'll dig into this a little more, is that there's a lot of pieces going on. Even in a cartoon illustration, it's almost overwhelming to think about how much is going on. And so our goal in natural resource science and management is to manage it, knowing that this is connected. But that can be hard. And an additional layer of complexity is that our governance structures might not be well set up to deal with it, because we have upstream management agencies that within, for example, the Department of Interior, and then we have downstream management agencies that manage our coasts and oceans. So what do we do in the face of this science and management? Complexity, well, if you're a modeler, you model it. And what we try to do is reduce the complexity. Your model's going to be wrong, but the idea, the hope is that we have something that's useful from this. And there's a couple of different approaches that we'll talk about today. First is we can create qualitative models with the goals maybe to describe, to illustrate, understand, communicate, and maybe connect ideas. And these can in fact be quite powerful. And then we have more what we think about probably here is what our ideas of models is computational, mathematical, quantitative models. And I argue that they have a lot of the same purposes of describing, characterizing, illustrating, understanding, communicating. But we can sometimes go further. We can validate assumptions and test hypotheses. We can make forecasts, and we can evaluate trade-offs. And so we'll talk about a handful of different types of models in today's seminar. We'll focus on kind of the first and end, but there's a lot of different models that are a part of this. So we'll talk about some conceptual modeling, which I think kind of lays the groundwork for this project. And these are developed from case studies, which themselves are models in a way. And then we'll talk about quantitative modeling, thinking about end-to-end connecting models and the difficulty of that. We'll present the hydrological model and estuary model, and I really want to show you some of the nuts and bolts and maybe think about it a little deeper is the Suwannee River ecosystem model. So we're getting into a little bit bigger stream here, the confluence here. We'll talk about this conceptual model that we developed from case studies, Gulf of Mexico, estuaries, and the watersheds. So for this research project that was led by Scott Alford, we conducted case studies of 6 Gulf of Mexico estuaries and their connected watersheds. And here we'll present a handful of those for the sake of time. And this shows all of them together. They all drain into the Gulf of Mexico, but they're very different in their characteristics. And for each of these, I'm going to show these plots here. This shows how the watersheds and the land use types from open water, natural and forest cover, and then human use from the system. So the first watershed I want to kind of return to, and some of the key characteristics to think about is, of course, the big one, the Mississippi River. It's characterized by its enormous size, which we mentioned before. And I used to live for a little bit in central Illinois in the Midwest. And what the key characteristic will be noticed is this drought, and this is agriculture. And being in central Illinois, you can drive for hours in any direction, and you drive through corn and soy. It's endless and sometimes terrible. All of that receives fertilizer, and all of that, of course, drains out through the watershed, ultimately to the Gulf of Mexico, and describes those hypoxia, or sometimes called dead zones, which is characteristic issue of this watershed. Louisiana is also sinking, which is a big problem if you live in that area, by the order of up to close to 100 square kilometers per year. And so there's enormous restoration projects that are being undertaken, largest ever undertaken. And what's happened is a lot of the Mississippi River. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
come on.
voyage, like. And so the Mississippi River has been canaled for shipping, also to prevent flooding in places like New Orleans, and then the sea levels are also rising. So there's a lot of work to try to combat this. The second watershed and estuary that we'll think about is the highly disturbed system. This is the Trinity, San Jacinto, and Galveston Bay system. And something you'll notice from this watershed is the new urban development that's in this area. In the top left, this is the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and bottom down here, this is Houston Metroplex. So there's been a lot of people that have moved to this area in the last few decades. It's also a heavily industrialized use, especially down near Galveston Bay. And that's because of the oil and natural gas industry that's there. So if you've ever been there, there's enormous oil refineries in that area, because that's where a lot of the oil comes in from the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a lot of legacy containments. Another key characteristic of the system that's really interesting is the variability in freshwater discharge. So over time, freshwater discharge has decreased. There's been a downward trend, largely potentially due to these municipal water withdrawals, but then there's also been these incredible freshwater flushing events. So the most dramatic is Hurricane Harvey, where the entirety of Galveston Bay, which is normally about 25 PSU, went to entirely freshwater for a period of, I believe, over 4 days. Which was kind of insane. And the third case study that we'll look at is kind of different in that it's relatively natural. It's the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint. This drains into the panhandle of Florida. It's a relatively natural system, except for up here, this is Atlanta, is part of this watershed, or part of the Atlanta Metroplex area. And a key characteristic that's kind of unfortunate that defines this area is in 2012, we witnessed the collapse of the historic oyster fishery, which was iconic of Apalachicola. It's this 150-year-old fishery. Oysters were relatively healthy compared to most of the world up until that point. And in a single year, we had about 98% population collapse, and they've been relatively slow to recover since then. And there's been a lot of post hoc work to try to understand what drove this. A lot of it done here at UF. And we think that there's no single smoking gun, but there's kind of a combination. So harvest played a role, but then also drought and hypersalinity. And so there was a period of drought happening at the time. And then and when you have hypersaline conditions in the estuary, this drives increased predation on oysters and oyster drills, and also increases disease. And so the driver of whether this was climatic due to natural causes or due to municipal water withdrawals actually been the subject of intense legal fighting taken up to the Supreme Court, with multiple Supreme Court cases, which have been dubbed the water wars in Florida and Georgia. So there's a handful of these case studies, and I promised the conceptual model to kind of draw some ideas from this. Before I show you that, I just want to acknowledge that we're not the first or only model. This is an example from Charlton et al., published within the last 5 years, and then these date back to Schuyler and Browder, 1998. Ours kind of updated with current literature. We kind of developed these from our regional case studies and really focused on this idea of the interactions with climate and land use change. And here's our model. It's not better or worse than any others, but maybe it's useful. On the right, this is the illustration of all these. We have a lot of different pieces, but kind of the main idea here is that the system is really driven by climate and land use. And I think the connection here is this freshwater here. The quantity, quality, timing, and variation of water is what kind of connects this whole system. Water drives the estuarine environment. And the environment itself drives the ecology. It drives the community structure, the foundation species, and the production. And the ecology is what provides these host and ecosystem services that are so important for coastal communities. And so there's a couple pieces that strike me from this. And I think the maybe the most important and concerning of these is potential compounding effects of climate. So if we think about, so if we have, particularly for droughts, and so if we have upstream droughts, you have decreased precipitation, and so you have decreased freshwater delivery during a drought condition. But also because depending on your land use, you have increased need for water from your freshwater system. So if you have crops, they're not getting natural rainfall, you're gonna have to water them more. So you have to draw more from your freshwater system. And if you have drought conditions, you likely are in a heat wave itself. And so your estuary itself has increased water temperature, you have increased evaporation and salinity. And so you have the potential for compounding effects from climate. The other, I think, most important key thing from climate is we're expecting increases in variability. So for example, in Galveston Bay, we saw these dramatic cases of going from decreased freshwater delivery to full live at one time. And then there's other impacts from climate. We have sea level rise. We see this with Louisiana land loss, and then we have forward expansion of tropical species. And with climate, you have land use, and these are all happening concurrently. So you have municipal water withdrawals, agricultural water withdrawals, and then you have water being taken out, and then you have things being put in. So you have runoff of pollutants and nutrients. And then for ecology, I think what we saw from our case study is that a lot of this can be shaped around our foundation species because there's feedback loops that surround these. It's all these with oysters, we talked about, but also salt marshes, seagrasses, sponges. And these can drive negative feedbacks. But so if your foundation species change, it changes the estuary, the hydrology, the water quality. These provide important habitats, and these can reorganize the entire ecosystem. So that was our conceptual model. Those were our case studies. Let's talk a little bit more about developing quantitative models. What people think of as hard force studies. This is a place that's this is a place that's near and dear to me, the Suwannee River area. This shows a map that's close by here in Gainesville. It's a gorgeous system. Suwannee River and its basin were the source of study. It represents nearly 250 miles. Drains from the Okefenokee Swamp down to Cedar Key. I think it's the largest undammed river in the southeast United States. Is that right? That confirmation. And you notice how much green here is in the satellite imagery. It's relatively undeveloped, not a lot of people, so maybe for Gainesville. And natural resources are critical to the economies in this region. So we have agriculture and forestry in the watershed. And then the coastal ecosystems are relying on fisheries, aquaculture, and tourism. So our question with this study was essentially the same as our conceptual model. How will changes in climate and land use affect the watershed and the estuary? And so this is the group that I showed you at the very beginning, and this is the schematic that overlays this project. And our team often used this kind of simplified version, which I think represents it relatively well. And there's 4 key parts. One not shown that we'll talk about. We had a landscape hydrological model, ecology model, the economic model, and stakeholder engagement that oversee it all. So just a little bit more about our framework. The landscape hydrology model, what we name the SWAT MODFLOW, it simulates the spatial explicit land use, and then does basically a whole lot of computers, a whole lot of things. Ask Kathleen if you want to know more about it, and gives you a whole lot of output. It's computationally intensive. And basically we train it on the past, and we're able to give future projections of what the watershed is going to look like. And then that feeds into our ecosystem model. I can tell you more about this, and that's what we'll talk about more in this talk today. And then both of these together inform our economic analyses. And for the sake of time in this seminar, we won't go too much into the economics, but if you have questions, we can try to discuss them. So importantly, when we're doing this modeling, is thinking about how these scenarios are developed and who develops these. And so the fourth and critical component is this stakeholder advisory committee. A lot of research talks about the need for co-production. It's oftentimes not done as well as I think things are talked about. It's really hard. It's really time consuming. I think something about this project that to me was incredible was that I think we got the right people in the room and it did the work to integrate them. These represent management agencies. I talked about some about how difficult management can be, the holistic system. And so there's a lot of work to try to get the right managers. They're interested in the room. And then also industry stakeholders, including tourism and recreation, and then also agriculture and natural resources, as well as environmental stakeholders and scientists, all part of this committee. And they were involved from the beginning to the end. So the project started in 2020. Our first meeting with them was in 2021. And for 3 or 4 years, we met with them continuously. And so they were an integral part of the project. And one of the key things they provide is they're the ones that help determine the scenarios for modeling, not the modelers. We went back and forth with them. And so there was land use and climate scenarios, 6 land use, 5 climate scenarios. We'll talk a little bit more about these, but these represent current land use, that how current state of things, and then the decision was made to really try to really see what are the impacts and kind of bookend with extremes. And so there was a couple extreme scenarios to see how do these models predict at the upper end if we went to extreme on it. So one extreme is that what if we expand agriculture as much as we can, particularly the high value agriculture, row cropping. What if we conserve as much as we can? And then what if we try to restore Florida to its original state, which is largely longleaf pine stands. And then there's a lot of interest in looking at future urban scenarios. How, if the population of Florida grows, how does that affect watershed? And then there was 5 climate scenarios here. So these are best, I think, shown by these 5 up top. So we have a baseline scenario, and then we wanted to look at hotter and wetter or hotter and drier. We don't really have to worry about it cooling. We know things are getting warmer. And then we looked under a moderate scenario with a RCP 4.5 or a more extreme scenario of RCP 8.5. And so we looked at wetter or drier, moderate or extreme. And so collectively, these are 30 scenarios in total. And so we have all of these, and we make our hydrology and our ecosystem, or we do our hydrology. And what I want to talk about here is connecting it to the ecosystem model. I'm gonna grab myself on the time check.
25 minutes total. but
Okay.
Probably leaves some for questions.
Okay, cool. Let's keep on rolling then. So I'm gonna with years of work and I don't know how many hours of computational time.
A lot.
A lot of computation time, build the entire hydrology model. We're gonna skip over that and just go summarize it, maybe in 2 to 4 key points. Climate was the dominant driver of the flow, how much water is going to be delivered into the system, and there's large uncertainty about that. And land use is the dominant driver of water quality. And as we dig into it, we'll look into this a little bit more with nutrients and production. And I think this was a really interesting hurdle and piece that we had to come across is that we had to figure out how to link a hydrology model to the ecosystem model. This is something that's kind of at the frontiers of ecosystem modeling, hasn't really been done before. And we had to develop a whole way to do it. And the hydrology team is the one that developed this methodology in the Estuary Linkage Model. I happen to have Nick Chin in the room, so he can describe this better. But this was kind of our Rosetta Stone to get hydrology outputs into a spatial ecosystem model. And I think the core idea, that got shifted over, was the key was color. And this is based on this iconic characteristic of the Suwannee River and its black water. So you can look at this example here, under a low flow condition, under this color enhanced imagery, you can see the blue marine freshwater, and you can see the black water plume of the Suwannee River, and under high flow conditions, you can see how that river plume changes. And back in the low flow conditions, you can see how the marine waters have moved back into shore. So again, a lot of work here that's summarized into kind of a single slide. This color was used as the freshwater tracer to produce mother model, and then daughter models were used to inform kind of these key parameters that were incorporated into the ecosystem model, namely salinity, temperature, and nitrates. We still might come back and use dissolved oxygen. And this was done with a suite of hierarchical quantile linear regressions. We're able to quantify the uncertainty. And this is what the outputs look like. As we move the use for the ecosystem model up top, these are kind of the final outputs. These colors represent all the different scenarios. And these are one point, but what we deliver into the ecosystem model are these spatial models. So these are ASCII maps done over time. And so these are the environmental drivers that's driving the ecosystem model. So that L model basically translate all of this into these spatial and temporal dynamic models. Phil, okay, way to capture that?
Yeah.
Okay. So
How
how
into parent and child models
Parent
instead
and
of
child.
daughter and mother. So
Okay,
it's parent and child.
okay, parent and child models. So let's dig into this a
That
little
looks
bit
similar.
more.
Yeah.
Let's talk about ecosystem models. They excite me, and I want to kind of introduce to this group what these are doing. And by ecosystem models, we're generally referring to ecological models, and in this case, food web models. And so this shows an example of a food web. And so each of these balls represents a biomass of what we call a functional group. Functional group represents a critter, basically a species, and it represents an age group within that species, or a group of species that occupy a similar niche, and then occupies the fleets. We see this up here in black, that are fisheries species. And the purpose of this is to evaluate changes in one part of the food web affect the other part. So if you picture, if you grab one of these balls and you change it, all those linkages are observed, and it's going to reverberate throughout that food web. And so this has been applied for a variety of environmental resource management questions. It's usually used for thinking about strategic advice of like what happened with these what if scenarios, and then to use practically, how can we manage the system precautionarily to make sure that we're not doing something to one part of the food web that's going to cause another part of the food web to do really bad in unexpected ways. So this is example of our estuary food web. These are estuary species that we have in here. So we've developed this food web here. And these exist in an environment where you have habitats where they live on, and then they're fed by primary production of these nutrients going up through the food web, and changes in primary production and habitat affect availability, growth, survival, and movement of these species, and those are in turn driven by the environmental drivers. These are the outputs coming from that, from the hydrology and ecosystem linkage model. And then on the other side of our food web is that these are viewed as natural resources, and so they have existence and consumptive values that are reliant on this food web. And so this is the ecopath with ecosystem modeling framework. It's generally in 3 steps. So I showed you kind of that idea of a static food web that's built in the ecopath model. And in ecosim, we conduct time dynamic simulations and can fit to long-term data over time. And in ecospace, if you have spatial questions, you might need a spatial model. We handle that in ecospace, where we run spatial temporal dynamic simulations. And so this is our Suwannee River Estuary Model, the SREM. It consists of 66 functional groups, which is considered probably a rather large ecopath model. And so down here are our primary producers and our detrital groups, and then these show the linkages to our primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary up the food web, and then at the top is our 8 fishing fleets, which represent commercial and recreational fishing fleets. Then we take that model and then we fit it to time dynamic. We do time dynamic simulations and ecosim. And for this case, some of that was done to parameterize the model. This was built by Dylan Sinikison. Just messed that up. That was one of Dave's PhD student, and then we updated this model with more information. A lot of this, I have these here. It kind of shows a lot of the information that goes into here, but the lion's share of it, I would say, comes from FWC, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, work to conduct fisheries independent monitoring. We have many years of observed data that we can fit to that we use to make the observed data and also parameterize these environmental preferences. We also have a lot of catch information, fisheries catch fishes. Fish that people catch, we have a lot more information for those than things they don't catch. So we have NOAA MREP data, and we also incorporated environmental data from USGS, data that you have collected, and also aquaculture data from Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So all this put into the ecosim model, and we fit these, and this is what happens when you plot all of it out. And if you zoom in, we can look at these individual species itself. And so this represents our time dynamic model that we run or historically, and then we're moving that into our spatial model. So this is ecospace. On the left shows that shows our aerial imagery of our ecosystem. You can almost see some of the the seagrasses and oysters in that aerial imagery. On the right, this is the ecospace model itself. And so each one of these grid cells is running ecosim, and then shows our habitats in the model. So we have oyster, salt marsh, seagrass, and then we built in clay leases. And you can have overlapped habitats. And what's running behind these is these ecosim mass balance equations. So there's a set of 2 master equations, these differential equations of what's eating what. And then in ecospace, basically things can move around. And so spatially, you parameterize the preferences to habitat and to the environmental drivers. And so the species, if they have the ability to disperse, will try to find preferred habitat and preferred environmental conditions. And then the fishing fleets, the fishers move around to try to catch the fish that they're targeting. And so parameterizing this kind of summed up is you parameterize these preference functions and then you drive these. So these are the environmental drivers, back those flashing maps that Nick and Nate and the hydrology group created. These are fed in as environmental drivers: salinity, temperature, and nutrients. So salinity and temperature affect the species through these preference functions, and nutrients are affecting the model through its primary production input. And then we also built in, which Dave led this, is these mediation functions. And I'll show some of the results that I think will show why these are important and we want to look into things we want to look into further. But basically, we're trying to capture this, the idea that as you have more nutrients, you have more phytoplankton. This causes shading, and shading impacts your seagrasses because seagrasses need light. So your seagrasses don't do as well. And then seagrass are also a key foundation habitat for many species. And so we parameterize these, the association of seagrass to the associated species with mediation functions. So the glossary term mediation function parameterizes an indirect effect, how one species affected another species without necessarily eating it. This is what ecospace looks like when it's running, and we collect all this data. So on the left, this shows a subset of species, and each one of these lines are a functional group, and they're moving up and down. And each one of these boxes shows species kind of growing and dying and then moving around in these. And then we take all the data out at the end. And so the results, collectively can be kind of quite a lot, and we have to kind of dig into these, I think, to be meaningful inference. But overall, what we found is that the ecosystem model is capable of reproducing many observed patterns in fish abundance from our fisheries independent monitoring programs. And we're able to capture trends and landings. Not a lot of them aren't perfect. These black dots represent the observed values or reference values, and the lines represent our modeled output. But overall, we're pretty happy with it. This actually is just a subset of these. And then we're able to take these and then run these for the future projections. So if you remember, we have 30 scenarios. So each one of these represents a different scenario. So each color is a different scenario. Each plot here is one of the functional groups, and the y-axis represents the biomass. And taken together, it's hard to draw inference. But I think the value of ecosystem models is to dig into this and maybe examine trade-offs. So I want to return to that phytoplankton seagrass. So this is one of the results of many from the hydrology group, is specifically if you hold climate constant and you have different land use scenarios that we modeled, what are the water quality drivers? And so on the y-axis, these are the nitrate loads to the aquifer, and the different color represent the contribution of those nitrate loads from the different types of agriculture. So we're gonna look at 4 of these land uses and really look probably compare most of these really to this agriculture expansion. And this is the idea. It's a bookend scenario that we try to grow as much crops everywhere as we can in this region, largely driven by row crop. And so we have a doubling of nitrate load under this scenario. And we can compare this with the other extreme is restoration forestry. So if we put long leaf pine in this area, and so we're now having very little nitrate load. Also, those pines are pulling up nutrients from the soil too. So in one scenario, we can compare a really extreme, a 200% increase to a 90% decrease. And so this is really driven in the food web by these interactions with phytoplankton and seagrass. And so again, these were, we defined these with these mediation functions with foraging and shading mediation. And this plot down here shows this agriculture expansion scenario, is that when we start expanding agriculture here, we see persistent increases in phytoplankton actually, and persistent declines in seagrass recovery. And when we look at the end plots, these are kind of shown here. So these orange plots are probably the things to reference all of them. So agriculture expansion, you have a considerable increase in phytoplankton compared to kind of our baseline current scenarios or conservation blueprint or restoration forestry, and then you have a conversely decline in seagrass. And so we can look at some of these groups to see how does this again reverberate throughout the food web. And so a key area that we will look at is forage fishes, and see these are key prey bases for a lot of our other groups, particularly our fisheries group, which managers want to know about. So for clupids and anchovies, they don't have much association with seagrass, and so they benefit from these agriculture expansion scenarios. So they're benefiting from the increase in nutrients into the system. But our mullet and our pinfish, which are highly seagrass associated, they use them as habitat. That's how they hide from predators. We're seeing declines in those scenarios compared relative to the other scenarios. And then we can look at the predators here, and this is what a lot of managers might really want us to look at, is changes, for example, on red drum and spotted sea trout. And we have a mix of effects here. So red drum and sea trout have moderate affinity to seagrass, but they also benefit from increased nutrients. Sheep don't have much association with seagrass. They really benefit in this agriculture expansion scenario. And then I think the strongest signal, or what we can really look at, is the top or upper trophic level predators that don't have a lot of fishing. And so, like, for example, our sharks and rays, we see the strongest signal is that they're doing much, much better in agriculture expansion because they're benefiting from the increases in these nutrients and production in the system. And so this shows maybe a non-intuitive result, and we can look at kind of trade-offs for restoration. Forestry actually drove lower production, and agriculture expansion drove higher production, what we think of as fish and stuff, but also had declines and effects on seagrasses. And I think this is an area really that we want to dig into further. So Dave and I are working on this currently. I'm trying to write this up a little bit more. And to detail, because we have to be careful here, these phytoplankton seagrass mediation functions and which define how phytoplankton affects seagrass, and then the mediation functions of how seagrass affects the other species. And something I wanted to kind of show to this group too, because I think some people might be working on, or might know people might be working on this. This is a case where I think we can do really tie in empirical work to this. And so we can, look at field experiments and field collection programs to try to better parameterize these functions. Largely, these were derived from theory. It would be really neat to build on these to do, for example, shading experiments or exclusion experiments that we could parameterize these functions better. And we could rerun these models with better parameterized functions. And so we're zooming back out here. I want to kind of
7 minutes, if no questions.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect. So I want to return to our original idea and kind of overlap this idea of our conceptual model and our quantitative end-to-end modeling framework. So underneath it is our conceptual model. For climate and land use, we're driving everything, and we kind of overlapped these colored boxes of what we ended up doing through the work. And so we developed this end-to-end modeling framework. And we started with the hydrology model that captures our climate and land use and drives our freshwater discharge, and then that drives the estuary environment, and we realized we need another model to actually capture this. And so we developed this estuary linkage model, we, the hydrology team, and then that informed our ecological model, and then these informed then ecosystem services. And so I'll return to the idea posed from the beginning, is that thinking about the land ocean continuum, these as one connected system is really difficult due to scale, due to complexity. And so that makes it challenging to study, do science at that scale. It makes it a challenge to manage. And so I posit again that models can maybe help us tackle that. They can help us understand, forecast, connect, and evaluate trade-offs. And so I showed a couple of examples. The conceptual models, for example, maybe help us understand these systems better. We had SWAT MODFLOW, which created these future-facing predictions. We developed an estuary linkage model. We had so many models that we had to develop more models to connect them. But this was critical in connecting these models, and then showed you an example of an ecosystem model and how we might use it to evaluate trade-offs. And I think this is going to be the kind of critical idea of thinking about a land ocean aquatic continuum, is that you have trade-offs between human and nature. And so as an ecosystem scientist, as a marine and coastal ecologist, I think about these in terms of healthy estuaries, but we also need to balance these very real needs to manage flood control for municipal water and to feed agriculture. And ultimately, the link that drives all of these is water. Yes, water, watersheds, wetlands, right? Bringing that all together. So, and very philosophically, with this quote from The River Runs Through It, is eventually all things merge into one, and the river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. I am haunted by waters. There's no one in between. Guess I'm haunted by waters too. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, man.
All right, appreciate it. We'll take questions from the room first. I'll check YouTube. Elliot, if you need to sneak out anytime, go for it. But I know you would like to talk to Holden more.
Yeah.
All right, we'll start with Nick. That's all right. Go ahead, Nick.
Someone else doing?
No, you're good.
Okay.
You're good.
That was a really cool presentation. One species that I looked at in particular, just as I chased them all over the state of Florida, is snook. And I saw like a giant spike in 2050 or
Yeah.
20 and towards the Suwannee River. And I'm sure temperature is one of the mediating factors of phytoplankton and seagrass growth up there.
Yeah.
Not just nutrients, but another one of David's former PhD students and friends, Calvin Kang, was looking at work about whole word expansion of mangroves. And I was wondering if that's something that has also been considered in the model, because I know, I know that's always where snook spawn, the eggs or the babies will come back and go up into estuaries and mangroves and stuff. So I was wondering if that's also another factor that's been looked at.
Yeah, that's in fact Correct me if I'm wrong, Dave. So that's how we parameterize snook in the model. Parameterizing invasive species, you have to sometimes kind of hack the model. So you have to put all the species in the model. When the model began, we really didn't have snook, and so we drove biomass to increase with snook. And to kind of ground that with empirical data, we ended up using, I think, mangrove cover. Is that
pattern of mangrove covering?
isn't that what we used?
It was like the frequency of mangrove sites in the FEM data, because we don't have, they can't distinguish between salt marsh and mangroves with the aerial imagery of the.
So that mangroves aren't in the model. We used basically the mangrove data because we didn't have as good a data with snook. We used better data from mangrove. We used that, we saw kind of a sigmoidal increase in mangroves, and we used that to drive snook into the model to kind of get to show that increase and get snook to 20.
Other questions for Holden? YouTube is characteristically quiet, so students in the seminar. Do you have a question for Holden?
I didn't. Speaking instead of using YouTube. So with the water scenarios that you're doing,
You came in a hell of a question. So
Yeah.
Well, what about the
you keep looking at like the nitrate increase from like the water flow change from agricultural, or you dealing with like other forms like detrital input changes, or what was your main focus?
We simplified it with salinity, temperature, and nitrate.
Just nitrate.
Yeah, so we're down.
Okay,
We also have dissolved oxygen, but we didn't use that.
so I guess my thing is with the like phytoplankton potentially reaching those levels. Instead of like using the dissolved oxygen as like a forcing function, like we see sometimes, right, with the blooms, you end up with the oxygen dead zones. Like, would you end up getting that with these like really high scenarios? You considered that at all, like having phosphorus, like shields kind of things?
So when phytoplankton
Yeah.
dies, does it, add to the detrital pool and cause oxygen demand?
Yeah, I know that, and that was the question from our stakeholders, just thinking about saying dissolved oxygen and kind of actually making that emergent and dynamic in the model, and it doesn't capture it.
Just wondering.
Yeah, it would be cool.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you have the answer to this one or if it's a bad question, but how much does like the effects of all of this cost on the environment? Like how much money is it cost to fix all or to stop doing it altogether?
So it's not a bad question. It was actually maybe the key question that people wanted to know. And so that was a lot of the economic analyses was on that. But there's probably complexity to that. And so you said, how much does it cost to fix? Which it was probably hard to answer, probably, and it also probably depends on what part. Generally, it oftentimes costs to try to fix it. So a couple examples is that like the Everglades restoration project, I think so far is up to about $25 billion has been spent on it. More plan being spent to try to restore the hydrology of the Everglades. The Mississippi River so far has been spent about $50 billion, with a lot more being planned to be spent to try to restore sediment diversion so that it's not sinking. To try to get back those kind of key critical ecosystem services. And so it's probably really good to think about, maybe, we can maybe think about things of what can we do now to prevent having to spend many billions of dollars in the future.
All right, let's give Dr. Harris one more round of applause. Thank you. You're welcome to stay active. Thank you everyone on YouTube and on Zoom. So next week, our speaker is going to be, just a moment. It is Dr. Katrina Pleasantite. Dr. Katrina says she's going to be talking about draining the springs, exploring public preferences for ecosystem services of the upper Florida aquifer. So trying to put a dollar value on things like springs restoration, how much does it actually pay to put in that money? For all the students, apologies for the delay on giving you feedback on your write-ups. I will catch up with that, had some family issues, but we will see you all next week. Thank you, YouTube, thank you, Zoom, and thank you, Dr. Harris.